Moving away from biodiversity now, our next speaker is a very eminent political scientist, Lord Anthony Giddens, Emeritus Professor from the London School of Economics, who's going to give us a political perspective on the challenges that we face. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. Let me thank the organizers for inviting me and wish everyone a very happy and successful conference. I'm kind of humiliated because I don't have any splendid slides. All I have is a crappy piece of paper, so at least I'm saving energy, I suppose. What I'd like to do in my 16 minutes is to concentrate on climate change and the political and economic response to it. I won't talk so much about more generalized problems of sustainability. I don't know how many people here will have seen the film The Matrix. The Matrix was about the intersection of two worlds. It was like a computer-generated world in which everybody sat around quite happy, looking at their own computers, just like the people down there and some in the audience, and life went on as normal. Whereas in the real world, outside the virtual world, it was terrible. Humanity was in a terrible mess. To me, this is a bit like a metaphor for the impact of the international negotiations about climate change and the reality of what is happening in our world. The international negotiations have now been going almost as long as Rio, some 18 years, international climate change negotiations. And when you look at those negotiations as they unfold, to me, they sort of, in some large part, exist in a sort of simulated world, where an enclosed world where success is determined in terms of how far you keep those negotiations going. Each time it's announced we have a roadmap, for example. In Durban, those talks were by many people pronounced a success, but what do? They say that, by and large, we won't do anything very much until the year 2020. So there's a kind of virtual world of conferences, and then there is the real world, where the real world has been very ably described by Will Stephan earlier, so I won't add much to it, but one should emphasize that in the real world, so far as climate change is concerned, things look very bleak. He sketched in all of these increasing curves. If you look at the proportion of CO2 in the atmosphere, as measured by the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, it now stands at 393 parts per million, the highest ever recorded. And the level of CO2 in the atmosphere as the prime greenhouse gas is not going down, far from it. It's actually accelerating. The Mauna Loa Observatory shows that for each 10-year period, the curve of increase of CO2 in the atmosphere is actually greater than it was for the decade earlier. This is a dramatic situation, as I would see it, for world society and for the future of industrial civilization, because I don't think one should try to normalize climate change. Climate change is something no other civilization has experienced, that is humanly induced climate change, or could have experienced. Climate change, so far as we know, is irrevocable. It's therefore similar to some processes of sustainability, but very different to some other major world problems. For example, if you take global poverty, it's a very bad thing, and we know it will intersect with climate change and so forth. But if global poverty is the same in 2050 as it is now, it will still be a very bad thing. In the case of climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions are going to the atmosphere all the time. We have no way, unless pending some major invention, of getting those gases out of the atmosphere. They have a cumulative effect. To me, it's an awesome thing that we are on the edge of changing the world's climate, perhaps in quite a radical way. Of course, we don't completely know, and probably permanently. And we are miles away from doing enough to reverse this trend, at least on a global level. For all the talk of the green economy, green growth, and so forth, there is not a single green economy in the world. The organization Climate Watch, or Climate Action Watch, does an annual ranking of some 60 countries in terms of what progress they're making towards creating a low-carbon economy. Their most recent analysis indicated that no country is on track in terms of its internal reforms to create an economy which would effectively keep world temperature at 2 degrees, which is by some people recognized as a reasonably safe level, although people like Jim Hansen question even that level. Not a single economy. Sweden comes top, but it's a very small country anyway. You look at the countries which have most effect, like the United States, it comes about 58th out of 60, and Canada comes 59th. Can't remember which was last in a particular sequence. But when you stand back, you look at the impact of climate change, we look at what we're doing to the world, there's still an incredible distance, really, between human action and a continually increasing infusion of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This is something unique in human history. So when people were talking earlier about the Anthropocene, I would, as a sociologist, I would treat the sociological counterpart, if you like, of the Anthropocene as what I call a runaway world. We've created risks which at the moment we simply cannot control and which are outstripping our attempts to control them. It's important to see how different this is from previous civilizations. If you take the case of nature, for example, for hundreds of years, people worried about what nature can do to us in terms of storms, floods, droughts, etc. Only about 60 or 70 years ago, maybe less, we started worrying, quite rightly, about what we've done to nature. This is a reversal of traditional risk mechanisms. The equivalent of the Anthropocene age, therefore, is the creation of risk situations which we have no previous experience of. These include also many others besides climate change, such as accumulation of nuclear weapons, where we cannot turn to historical experience to resolve them, and where the uncertainties involved won't be resolved until it's too late. We have never had to face risks of this sort before as collective humanity, and we've never had the problem of facing them on a global level. See, this is a scenario which this conference, I hope, will make a material contribution to resolving, because to me there is an enormous difference between the level of risk we created and our response to them. In the case of climate change, therefore, I should say that I'm not trying to denigrate the efforts of the UN or Rio +20, which I strongly support, but surely we need something like a bit of a paradigm change if we're really going to have substantive effect upon what is a process to me which, as was said by Will Stephan, under some scenarios could simply wipe industrial civilization off the face of the earth effectively. It's an issue which is so huge it's hard to comprehend it. So I'll say briefly what a new emerging paradigm might look like, but it'll have to be very brief. First of all, it seems fairly clear that much of the action will have to happen below the level of the nation state. It will have to incorporate this new phenomenon of a globalizing world, which is a global civil society, an activist global civil society. We have to look to networks across the world formed by cities, formed by action groups, formed by young people, as we saw so ably performing a bit earlier, to try to harness real change on the ground. It's not enough to have notional change, you must have real change on the ground. So if one looks at the transition towns movement or the large-scale association of big cities across the world, at least there is something substantial happening there. The problem is, how do you integrate that? Because this is a global issue, and that problem still remains. Second, we can't do without nations. On the level of nations and nation states, it looks to me that, as in the rest of international relations, the United Nations has lost a lot of the influence it used to have, perversely, given the integrated nature of our world. So we're going to have to look to states, groups of states, regional agreements, more than we did over the past 16 or 17 years. And I have some hope that the large developing countries might play a much more significant role as leadership countries. You know, the old paradigm was the industrial countries must take responsibility. We're going to blame you as the developing world for increasing emissions in the world. It's your responsibility. Well, it is the responsibility of industrial countries, but it seems to me that China and Brazil particularly are likely to assume important leadership positions for the whole world community, and this is a positive move. Third, I would argue, for all the talk of renewables, which are very, very important, we must emphasize renewable energy, but renewables, by the IEA latest calculation, only make up 1% of the total world's energy mix. Only 1% of the world's total energy mix, if you discount hydro and you discount nuclear. So renewables have to be encouraged for sure, but they won't, you know, emphasizing investment in renewables won't arrest the trends, destructive trends affecting in our climate. So it seems to me we have to focus more on the fossil fuel industries directly. The fossil fuel industries have enormous inertia within the world economy, and we should be looking at things as trying, for example, making much more effort to close down coal-fired power stations. The coal-fired power stations were called by Jim Hampson institutions of death, or various versions of that term. So maybe a bit extreme, but coal is the most lethal greenhouse gas. We should have much firmer action on trying to enforce that, especially the larger countries, start major programs of closing down their coal-fired power stations. And there is quite a lot of action going on, for example, in China, certainly among closing the older coal-fired power plants. Finally, fourthly, I would argue we need a new kind of politics, and that politics I would describe as what I call, if you'll forgive me, utopian realism. We need a utopian angle on the world because we can't go on this way. It's no good supposing that growth will only be brought about by having iPad 4, iPad 5, iPad 6. We know that we need a different model of development. To me, this applies within the industrialized world, and it also applies to the so-called developing world or emerging economies. India and China cannot continue their current process of economic development, mimicking the West, because it is simply too destructive in environmental and in other ways. So we need an alternative model of development, and it's up to us to look for such a model. For me, this means, as Will Stephan said, on a sociological and economic level, looking at system change. We need an element of utopianism, but it has to be realistic, because this is a real and urgent pressing issue. The gigantic growth of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere is a real pressing and urgent issue. So where should we look? Well, if I can just give you a concrete example in closing, there's a large-scale discussion now of introducing electric cars. And electric cars are on the market in quite a few countries. But we should be really looking at the whole-scale transformation of transport systems. And we should be encouraging the large developing countries to leap ahead of our own Western transport system. For anyone who's interested in this, I recommend that you look at the MIT study called The Future of the Automobile, which argues you could have a completely different transportation system from one at the moment, which could be a zero-carbon transportation system, where cars wouldn't look like cars look today, where you would have what they describe as a mobility internet using a smart card system, breaking down the division between private and public ownership, which we have at the moment in most transport systems. To me, we need a utopian realist vision in many areas. It must have purchase, it must be real, but it also must look beyond the world which we're accustomed to living in. So my concluding thought would be to support the leitmotif of this conference as I heard it described earlier, which I would express in the words of the suffragettes from 100 years ago. The motto of the suffragettes was, deeds, not words. So we could say, I think, as intellectuals perhaps, deeds, not only words. Thank you very much for your attention.
Theme in our next panel discussion. So thank you very much, Lord Giddens. We've got loads of questions for you. You've provoked quite a storm on Twitter here. I'm going to just put one of them to you. Let me choose one here. From Jinhua Zhao at Michigan State University. Thank you for sending this in. The lack of leadership of the US in international climate negotiations is largely due to internal politics, especially backtracking in public opinion, says Jinhua. From a sociological perspective, what can be done, especially by scientists, to effectively enable policy change driven via public opinion?
Well, this is a really excellent question because I had some hope. I wrote a book called Politics of Climate Change, not that I'm trying to promote or anything, about 4 years ago.
I'm going to just stop you there. I'm not sure we can hear you that well, Lord
Sorry,
Giddens.
can you hear me now?
Yeah, go for it.
As I say, this is an excellent question. I wrote a book on the politics of climate change about 4 or 5 years ago, in which I was still hoping the United States could provide world leadership. That has definitively not happened. It's a tragic aspect of our attempts to control climate change. And it's tragic to me that climate change has become so polarized politically in the United States. I cannot emphasize too strongly, climate change is not a left-right issue. It's not a left-right issue, so it's tragic that it's become one. What can we do about it? Well, I think the contribution of the United States will be very large, but it will happen below the level of the federal government. It will happen from state governments, it will happen from cities, it will happen from local organizations.
And what can scientists do to try and
well, I was actually going to get around to that. I mean, I know true scientists have slides, and I should have brought a slide saying what scientists can do. But what scientists can do is something, to me, absolutely fundamental. I feel we must renew an assault upon the climate change skeptics. I think it's not enough to say that we accept dialogue, as of course we do, but we must re-emphasize the serious nature of the risks we're facing. I would like to see that done on an international level, which this conference is a contribution to, maybe in the wake of the next round of IPCC reports. Science is the medium, really, of us coming to grips with climate change. So we all have to follow the activities of scientists in any case, and I commend all the scientists working on these issues here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. An excellent and inspiring talk. He's urging you to launch an assault on climate change skeptics.